In the winter of 1887, in a forgotten corner of rural Pennsylvania, something impossible began happening in the Whitmore family. On January 3rd, 7-year-old Margaret Whitmore celebrated her birthday. But when January 3rd, 1888 arrived, Margaret still looked exactly 7 years old. Her skin hadn't changed. Her height remained the same. Even the small scar on her knee from a fall looked identical. Her parents assumed it was just slow growth, but when 5 years passed and Margaret still appeared to be 7, the family physician, Dr. Samuel Hendricks, became deeply disturbed. He had delivered Margaret himself, verified her birth records, yet this child before him defied every medical principle he'd learned at Johns Hopkins. Margaret's younger brother Thomas, now supposedly 12, looked no older than 9. And their sister Emma, who should have been 15, could pass for 11. The Whitmore children had stopped aging entirely. Hello, where are you from? If you're fascinated by the darkest mysteries America tried to bury, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Cursed America. Drop a comment telling me which state you're watching from, because what I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about the hidden history lurking in your own backyard. This isn't folklore. This is documented horror that doctors, genealogists, and historians stumbled upon and then desperately tried to forget. The Whitmore family lived in Covenant Hollow, an isolated parish in the Allegheny Mountains where 37 families had settled in 1823. These families were religious separatists, breaking from mainstream Protestant churches to form their own strict community. They believed in self-sufficiency, rejected outside medicine, and most crucially, they believed in keeping their bloodlines pure. The founding families intermarried exclusively within the parish for generations. The Whitmores married Carters, who married Bishops, who married Thorntons, who married back into the Whitmores. By 1880, the family trees of Covenant Hollow weren't trees at all. They were tangled webs where the same names appeared over and over, where cousins married cousins, where genetic material circulated through the same limited pool for 60 years. Dr. Hendricks had moved to the nearby town of Millbrook in 1883, and Covenant Hollow residents occasionally sought his services despite their religious objections to outside help. When he first examined the Whitmore children in 1892, he documented something that made his hands shake as he wrote, "Margaret, now supposedly 12 years old, had the bone density, tooth development, and growth plates of a 7-year-old. Her medical age was frozen. Thomas showed the same impossible pattern. So did Emma. But it wasn't just arrested development, it was arrested time itself. Their hair grew at normal speed and had to be cut. Small wounds healed normally. They got sick and recovered. Yet their bodies refused to mature." Hendricks began investigating other families in Covenant Hollow, and what he discovered made him physically ill. The Thornton twins, supposedly 16, looked 10. The Bishop boy, claimed to be 14, appeared 8. The Carter girl, documented as 18 in parish records, had the physical development of an 11-year-old. 23 children across 9 families had stopped aging at various points between 6 and 12 years old. Some had been frozen for 3 years, others for nearly a decade. The parish elders forbade Hendricks from examining anyone further and banned him from the community. But he'd already seen enough to fill notebooks with observations that would later be classified as medical heresy. What Hendricks couldn't have known in 1892 was the genetic catastrophe brewing in Covenant Hollow's isolated gene pool. Modern geneticists who have reviewed the limited records estimate the founding families had an effective population of about 70 reproductive individuals. After 60 years of exclusive intermarriage, the coefficient of inbreeding in some children exceeded 30%, higher than offspring of full siblings. This level of inbreeding causes what geneticists call genetic load, where recessive mutations that normally remain hidden become expressed in devastating combinations. But the aging phenomenon Hendrix witnessed was something science still cannot fully explain. By 1895, Hendrix had documented 47 cases across Covenant Hollow. The community's own records showed that no child born after 1875 had successfully aged past their early teens. Some children appeared to age normally until 7 or 8, then stopped. Others halted at 10 or 11. A few made it to 12 before the aging process mysteriously ceased. Meanwhile, adults in the community aged normally, or in some cases, seemed to age faster than they should, developing elderly characteristics in their 40s. The parish was becoming a nightmare of perpetual children and prematurely ancient parents. The medical community dismissed Hendrix as a fraud when he tried to present his findings. The Journal of the American Medical Association rejected his paper, calling it unscientific fantasy. But Hendrix persisted, and in 1898, he convinced Dr. William Osler, one of the founding professors of Johns Hopkins Hospital, to visit Covenant Hollow with him. Osler spent 3 days examining the children, reviewing birth records, interviewing families, and conducting physical assessments. His private notes, discovered in archived collections in 1978, describe his horror. Osler documented skeletal X-rays showing bones that hadn't aged in 5 to 7 years. He noted dental records proving adult teeth weren't erupting on normal schedules. He measured heights and weights that hadn't changed despite adequate nutrition. And he recorded one observation that still chills medical historians. Some of these children remember being younger. They have memories spanning years longer than their physical development should allow. Osler never published his findings. His notes indicate he feared being destroyed professionally if he brought such impossible claims to the medical establishment. Instead, he quietly recommended that Covenant Hollow be studied by geneticists. But in 1898, genetics as a science barely existed. Mendel's work on inheritance was still being rediscovered. The concept of genes wouldn't be coined for another decade. The medical tools needed to understand what was happening didn't exist yet. In 1902, the situation in Covenant Hollow deteriorated catastrophically. Several of the frozen children began showing signs of rapid, chaotic aging. 10-year-old appearances would suddenly shift to 14 within weeks, then reverse back to 9. Growth spurts would happen overnight, then regress. One teenage girl, Sarah Thornton, reportedly aged from apparent age 11 to apparent age 16 in a single month. Her body developing so rapidly, she experienced constant pain. Then she reversed, shrinking back over 3 months. The community physician, a parish member named Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore, who was himself a product of 3 generations of cousin marriages, kept meticulous records of these fluctuations. His journals, seized during a state investigation in 1924, describe biological chaos. Children whose epiphyseal plates would close and reopen, whose secondary sexual characteristics would appear and vanish, whose very metabolism seemed to oscillate between childhood and adolescence without ever reaching normal adulthood. The most disturbing cases involved mental development. While bodies remained frozen or fluctuated wildly, minds continued to mature normally. By 1905, there were 20-year-olds trapped in bodies that looked 8. They had adult thoughts, adult desires, adult frustrations contained in child-sized frames. The psychological torment was documented in letters some of them wrote, letters found hidden in the walls of abandoned Covenant Hollow homes decades later. One letter, written by Margaret Whitmore in 1907 when she was 27, 7 years old but still appeared physically 7, described suicidal ideation, rage at her parents, and a desperate plea to understand why God had cursed her. She would remain in that frozen state until her death in 1931 at age 51, having spent 44 years looking like a child. The parish elders, realizing their isolation policy had created this catastrophe, finally broke their religious prohibition in 1910 and desperately sought outside marriages to introduce new genetic material. But by then, the damage ran too deep. Children born to marriages between Covenant Hollow residents and outsiders still showed abnormal aging patterns, though less severe. The genetic mutations had become fixed in the population. Whatever combination of recessive alleles caused the aging disruption was now present in nearly every family line. Between 1910 and 1920, the population of Covenant Hollow collapsed. Young adults who appeared physically adolescent left the community, trying to build lives elsewhere, though most faced devastating discrimination when their true ages were discovered. Families stopped having children. The parish churches emptied. By 1920, fewer than 100 people remained in a settlement built for several hundred. The community was dying, and its darkest secrets were about to be exposed. In March 1924, a census taker named Robert Finch entered Covenant Hollow as part of routine enumeration. What he found shocked him so profoundly, he immediately contacted state authorities. Finch documented families where supposed teenagers looked prepubescent, where birth certificates showed ages 15 to 20 years older than physical appearances suggested. He found adults in their 60s caring for adult children in their 30s and 40s, who looked like middle schoolers. He discovered Margaret Whitmore, now 44 years old, still frozen at approximately 7 years physical age, living with her 82-year-old mother in a decaying farmhouse. The state of Pennsylvania launched an investigation. Medical examiners, geneticists from newly established university programs, and public health officials descended on Covenant Hollow. They exhumed bodies from the parish cemetery and found skeletal remains that didn't match recorded death ages. They interviewed the remaining residents and uncovered the full scope of the intermarriage. They examined the frozen children, now mostly frozen adults, and documented cases that defied medical explanation. The investigation report, sealed for 50 years and partially declassified in 1974, concluded that Covenant Hollow represented an unprecedented genetic disaster caused by extreme consanguinity, but couldn't explain the aging disruption mechanism. Modern geneticists, who have studied the limited available evidence, believe the aging phenomenon involved multiple interacting genetic factors. Extreme inbreeding can cause disruption of endocrine pathways, particularly those involving growth hormone, thyroid function, and sex hormones. The combination of mutations affecting these systems could theoretically create individuals whose hormonal signals for maturation are disrupted or absent. But this doesn't fully explain the cases where aging stopped and then resumed erratically, or why some individuals were affected while siblings were not. Some researchers have proposed the involvement of telomere dysfunction, where the cellular mechanisms controlling aging became dysregulated. Others point to possible epigenetic factors, where gene expression patterns became locked in juvenile states. The truth is, with the limited genetic material available and the primitive state of genetic science in the 1920s, we may never know the complete mechanism. The investigation also uncovered evidence that parish elders had known about the genetic crisis for decades and had covered it up. Letters between church leadership from 1898 to 1910 showed them debating whether to seek outside help or maintain isolation, with isolation winning due to religious conviction and shame. They had sentenced their own children to biological imprisonment rather than admit their marriage practices had failed. The scandal destroyed what little remained of Covenant Hollow's community structure. By 1930, Covenant Hollow was effectively abandoned. The few remaining families scattered to surrounding towns, often changing their names to escape the stigma. The physical structures of the parish fell into ruin. The churches were demolished in the 1940s. The cemetery was relocated and records were sealed. Pennsylvania state authorities made a deliberate decision to let Covenant Hollow fade from memory, fearing that publicity would harm the surviving affected individuals who were trying to build new lives. Margaret Whitmore died in 1931 at a state facility, her death certificate listing her as 51 years old, but her autopsy report, now declassified, noted her skeletal age appeared to be approximately 9 years old. Her bones had never fully ossified. Her skull sutures remained partially open. Her brain was normal adult size, but contained in a child-sized cranium, creating neurological problems in her final years. She was buried in an unmarked grave, one of 17 frozen children who died between 1925 and 1945. All of them legally adults, all of them physically frozen in childhood. The last known survivor of the Covenant Hollow aging phenomenon was Thomas Bishop, who died in 1968 at the documented age of 73. His death occurred in a nursing home under an assumed name, and his medical records indicated he appeared to be in his late 50s despite his true age. Thomas had been one of the children whose aging resumed partially in adolescence, allowing him to reach an apparent physical age of about 16 by his actual age 25, where he remained frozen for the rest of his life. He never married, never had children, and worked as a night janitor at a Pennsylvania steel mill for 40 years, avoiding social contact and living in terror that someone would discover his secret. The complete medical records from Covenant Hollow were stored in Pennsylvania State Archives, but were partially destroyed in a fire in 1951. What remains are fragments of case studies, birth and death records, and the personal accounts of a handful of investigators. The genetic samples that might have solved the mystery were never properly preserved with 1920s technology. By the time DNA analysis became available in the 1980s, there was virtually nothing left to test. A few bone fragments from exhumed remains yielded limited genetic data, confirming extremely high levels of inbreeding, but unable to identify specific causative mutations. Modern medical literature occasionally references the Covenant Hollow case in discussions of the effects of consanguinity, but always in veiled terms, never naming the location or families involved. Medical ethicists point to it as an example of why genetic counseling is crucial for isolated populations. Genealogists study it as a cautionary tale about the collapse of closed genetic pools. But the full horror of what happened, children trapped in frozen bodies for decades, adults living and dying without ever experiencing normal physical development, families torn apart by shame and secrecy, remains largely forgotten. The site of Covenant Hollow is now part of a state forest. The roads that once led to the parish are overgrown. The foundations of homes and churches are scattered through the woods, barely visible under decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. Hikers occasionally stumble across these ruins and wonder about the community that once existed there. If they search hard enough, they might find the relocated cemetery, now just a clearing with a single marker stating historical burial site, 1823 to 1929. No names, no dates, no hint of the nightmare those graves contain. In recent years, a few descendants of Covenant Hollow survivors have begun speaking publicly, sharing family stories passed down in whispers. They described grandparents who died looking like children, uncles and aunts who were hidden from public view, family photographs that were destroyed because they showed impossibilities. One woman, interviewed anonymously in 2019, described her grandmother showing her a photograph from 1935. It showed a family gathering where what appeared to be 3 children were actually adults in their 30s and 40s. The photograph was burned after being shown, continuing the family tradition of erasing evidence. The genetic legacy of Covenant Hollow persists in subtle ways. Genealogists tracking the dispersed families have noted slightly higher rates of endocrine disorders, growth abnormalities, and developmental delays in some descendant lines, even those several generations removed and heavily outcrossed. The mutations introduced by extreme inbreeding don't simply vanish. They persist at low frequencies, occasionally manifesting when 2 carriers coincidentally marry. Most of these modern cases are mild and treatable with hormone therapy. Nothing like the catastrophic effects seen in the original Parish, but they're genetic echoes of decisions made 200 years ago. What happened in Covenant Hollow represents one of the most extreme documented cases of inbreeding depression in a human population. The effective population size, duration of isolation, and prohibition on outside marriage created conditions similar to endangered species maintained in small captive populations. The biological consequences were predictable: increased genetic disease, reduced fertility, and population collapse. But the specific manifestation of disrupted aging was unique and remains only partially explained. It's a case study in how religious ideology, social isolation, and genetic ignorance can combine to create human catastrophe. The children of Covenant Hollow paid the price for their ancestors' decisions. They lived and died as biological impossibilities, their suffering invisible to history, their very existence denied by the scientific establishment of their time. Margaret Whitmore, frozen at 7 for 44 years. Thomas Bishop, trapped at 16 for 48 years. Sarah Thornton, whose body fluctuated chaotically until she died screaming at age 29. Dozens more whose names we don't know, whose stories were buried with them, whose pain was so profound that their own families chose to erase them from memory rather than face the shame. The 1924 investigation was supposed to bring help and understanding, but instead it brought judgment and abandonment. The frozen children were treated as freaks rather than victims, studied briefly and then forgotten. The medical establishment moved on to more explainable cases. The state sealed the records and demolished the evidence, and the survivors were left to live out their broken lives in isolation, carrying secrets they couldn't share, inhabiting bodies that betrayed them every day. If you want to understand the true cost of this tragedy, imagine being 20 years old with the body of an 8-year-old, watching your mind mature while your reflection never changes, feeling adult emotions with no way to express them, being treated as a child when you're fully conscious and aware. Imagine the rage, the desperation, the crushing isolation. Then imagine living that way not for months or years, but for decades, until you finally die of old age in a body that never aged. That was the reality for dozens of people in Covenant Hollow. The story of Covenant Hollow challenges our assumptions about what's possible in human biology. It reveals how fragile our development really is, how easily the complex systems controlling growth and maturation can be disrupted when genetic diversity collapses. It shows us that the human body isn't as fixed and predictable as we like to believe, that extreme conditions can create extreme outcomes we don't have frameworks to understand. And it reminds us that historical atrocities don't always involve violence or deliberate cruelty. Sometimes they're the result of good intentions, religious faith, and ignorance colliding with genetic reality. The frozen children of Covenant Hollow are gone now, the last one dead for over 50 years. But their story persists as a warning. Isolated populations with restricted gene pools will face genetic catastrophe eventually, whether they're religious communities, geographic isolates, or endangered species. The mathematics of population genetics are unforgiving. Diversity is survival, isolation is death, and the price is paid not by those who make the decision but by their descendants, who inherit broken genes and broken bodies and broken lives. So when you hear about isolated religious communities or tight-knit groups that restrict marriage to insiders, remember Covenant Hollow, remember Margaret, Forever 7, remember the children who stopped aging and the adults who had to watch them suffer. Remember that genetic disasters don't announce themselves. They accumulate silently across generations until suddenly the damage is catastrophic and irreversible. And remember that we have the scientific knowledge now to prevent these tragedies, if only we choose to use it, and if communities choose to listen. That's the story of Covenant Hollow, the hidden 1924 secret that doctors couldn't explain and society chose to forget. If this story disturbed you, good, it should. Reality is often more horrifying than fiction precisely because it actually happened. These were real people, real suffering, real lives destroyed by decisions made generations before they were born. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity or a mystery, but as a tragedy and a warning. Hit that subscribe button to Cursed America for more buried American history that'll keep you up at night. And let me know in the comments, should stories like this stay buried or do we have a responsibility to remember? I'll see you in the next one, where we dig up more secrets America tried to bury forever.